What's actually more likely to happen, and what's counterintuitive, is that prices may actually go up. But the reason that this happens is because there are so many myths floating around about the commission lawsuit settlement. It is crazy. And today I am going to debunk the biggest myths and questions that I have received since that commission lawsuit settlement came down. Now, I have made a couple videos on this topic that seem to be a very popular subject. You can catch one of those right here. If you're like a lot of realtors, you're probably freaked out. You're asking tons of questions and you're wondering what's going to happen. So I encourage you to watch all the way to the end, because I'm going to talk about all the different questions and myths that are floating around, as well as all the misinformation that is out there. If you have a question that I haven't answered, please throw that down in the comments below and I will make sure to address it. So let's dive right in. The first myth that I have heard is that the NAR settlement forces brokers to reduce their commission. That could not be further from the truth. That is not what the settlement does at all. What the settlement actually does is it eliminates buyer-broker compensation from being advertised as a separate field in the multiple listing service. In the past, the way this worked, of course, if you've been in real estate, you probably know, is that in the MLS, there would be a field for broker compensation on the buyer side. And if you were an agent that represented the buyer and you brought that buyer to the table and they bought the property, you would receive the stated commission that was right in the MLS. Going forward, that field is going to go away. However, that does not mean that they have eliminated buyer broker fees or that they have reduced those fees. Those fees have always been negotiable, even though they've been set in the MLS, and they've always been subject to a broker submitting a different compensation request or otherwise negotiating that fee. So that is an absolute myth. And by the way, on the seller side, this settlement did not affect those commissions one way or another. So a listing agent can still negotiate any compensation that they want with their seller client, as has always been the case. Compensation and realtor commissions have always varied based upon skill, experience, presentation, and how that agent is able to communicate value to the client, whether that's a seller or a buyer. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. If you're new here, I'm Danny, and my mission is to help you build an amazing real estate business that funds your dream life using my over 20 years of experience in the real estate business as a broker and team leader and coach. So if you're getting value from this video, I want to ask you for a quick favor. Hit that like button down below so YouTube sends this video out to the YouTube universe, and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Back to the video. The next myth I want to debunk, which I have actually heard, is that the settlement prohibits sellers from paying buyer agent compensation. That is wrong as well. As I mentioned, the only thing that's happening here is that the compensation is eliminated from the multiple listing service. However, a seller can still pay a buyer broker in a transaction. And what's going to happen is that this is really going to switch over to being like the system that is handled in commercial real estate and has been done that way in most areas for a very long time, and has also been done this way in residential real estate in certain states and areas already for a very long time. So a buyer broker can still be compensated through the transaction, whether that's through a credit by increasing the purchase price to cover it, or through a direct payment from either the seller or the buyer, which I'll talk about later. But this settlement in no way eliminates that the seller can pay the buyer broker. That is a complete myth. The next myth, or really the question that I've heard on this topic, is that the settlement is actually going to be a big win for home buyers who can now negotiate their fee or who can pay less. Now, I will tell you that I think this is a complete myth, but it is kind of questionable. So again, in the old way, that compensation was simply set forth in the MLS. Now what will happen is that agents will be able to negotiate that fee with their buyer clients when they conduct a buyer consultation and when they get a buyer representation agreement signed. Now that compensation, whatever you decide to charge as a buyer's agent, I'm not telling you what to charge, don't sue me, and whatever that fee is, can either be paid by the buyer directly, or it can be paid and built into the transaction, paid by the seller, either through a direct credit or through compensation in another way, or the purchase price can be adjusted to cover it. So there's a lot of different ways to get that buyer agent paid, but the fact is that although buyers may be able to negotiate that compensation if they're paying it directly, for the most part, nothing really is going to change there. All right, here's the big one that you've probably been waiting for, because the whole intent of this litigation was to say that home prices were artificially inflated because of the compensation rules, and that when we do this, home prices are going to come down. I will tell you that that is one big fat myth and one big fat lie. What determines home prices in real estate is simply supply and demand. It is not realtor broker fees. So what's going to happen here is that sellers are still going to want what they want for their property. If someone wanted to sell their home for $1 million, just because this settlement came out, they're not going to suddenly say, oh, my fees went down, so now I'm going to sell the home for less. There is no chance of that happening. What's actually more likely to happen, and what's counterintuitive, is that prices may actually go up. I did talk about this a little bit on the last video that I did on this settlement, but the reason that this happens is because if a listing agent meets with a seller and doesn't properly explain the process of how this is all going to work, what could happen is that the seller will be under a false impression that they don't have to pay a buyer broker fee. As I talked about at the beginning of this video, they are still going to have to pay a buyer broker fee in one way, shape, or form or another, because the proceeds have to go somewhere. And so what's going to happen is that prices could go up to cover that fee, which is pretty crazy, as it's the actual opposite of what this litigation intended to do. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. If you've ever wondered where your next real estate client or commission check is coming from, or you're trying to scale your business to 6 or 7 figures, I want to invite you to book a free business strategy call by using the link down below. We'll hop on the phone, we'll do a deep dive into your business, we'll see what's working, we'll see what isn't. By the way, I have absolutely nothing to sell you. It's all free, and we'll see if potentially partnering with my team or my real estate group can be a benefit to you. But either way, I guarantee that you'll leave the call with a ton of value and a plan of action that you can execute right away to grow your business. Book that call, and I'll talk to you then. Now back to the video. And speaking of the litigation, another myth that I've heard is that the money coming from this litigation, and there are hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to be paid out by brokerages and by NAR and MLSs and all these other parties. The myth is that that money is going to go to the aggrieved home sellers and buyers who were taken advantage of in this situation. Well, let me tell you something. As a former attorney who understands the process, the people that are really going to get paid in this, and the ones that have cleaned house, are the lawyers. That's right, folks. When a class action lawsuit is brought, the majority of the money goes to the attorneys. So hypothetically speaking, we have a $400 million settlement or whatever the number is. Half of that's going to go to the lawyers. You take the other half and you divide it by the thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that might be involved in the class action. And I think that a home seller is going to be lucky to get a check for $10. So who wins? That's right, the lawyers. So those are the most common myths and objections and questions that I've gotten about this commission lawsuit settlement. If you have something that's on your mind that I didn't cover, please throw it down in the comments below, and I will personally address each and every one of those.